My name is Ian Morrison, and I speak for the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. It's an independent watchdog for Canadian programming on the air and online. It works in the Anglophone sector of the country. Friends is not affiliated with any broadcaster or political party, and we are supported by 175,000 Canadian families, people like these.
The CBC that I want is a civilizing, connecting voice
that fosters dialogue and collaboration between the diverse corners and perspectives within our country.
And I think it's absolutely crucial that we, as citizens of Canada, own this particular piece of our cultural voice.
The CBC I want is one that is involved in investigative journalism, is one that speaks truth to power, is one that
is a national, public, interactive, rich media, collaborative platform to enable a great conversation in this country.
To talk to each other, to tell each other their stories, to educate and inform and entertain and partner with the project of being Canadian.
There has to be a connective tissue. There has to be something that reflects our pulse, our heartbeat, our thought patterns. And this is the CBC I want.
Sorry, please open your mic. Thank you.
These comments come from 8 town hall consultations across the country in recent months called the CBC We Want. Although the participants are big supporters of public broadcasting, like all friends, they believe that they have a right and a responsibility to offer constructive criticism. Je veux souligner que...
I would like to stress that when we criticize the CBC, we're not targeting the talented people who actually make programs, but rather specific policies and practices of its senior management.
Is properly funded to do its job. In poll after poll, a significant majority of Canadians say they support maintaining or increasing public funding for CBC. We recognize that your Commission has no power to establish the CBC's parliamentary allocation, but we do urge you to send a strong message in your decision that the current level of funding is insufficient to discharge CBC's statutory mandate. Only 4 of 26 Western democracies spend a lower proportion of GDP than Canada on public broadcasting: Portugal, Poland, New Zealand, and the United States of America. CBC has been singled out for disproportionate damage by the government. From 2006 to 2015, total program spending will have increased by 15%, while spending on CBC will have declined by 22%. That's a 37% gap based on budget and Treasury Board data. CBC's response to this financial crisis has been to replace declining funding with more commercial revenue. This is a bad business strategy and also bad public policy. It has not prevented deep cuts to CBC's programs, services, and staff. It has not resulted in increased audiences or profit. It has alienated core supporters, and it has skewed programming and scheduling decisions. This is why Friends is profoundly opposed to the CBC's request for permission to bring ads back to some of its English and French radio services. This is also why we recommend that the Commission look closely at alternative funding models for a less commercial CBC English television, especially if next year the CBC were to lose the Hockey Night in Canada franchise that we estimate represents more than half of all of the English television network's ad revenue. And this is why our written submission proposes a number of specific license conditions or expectations, commitments regarding the type of program content we believe is essential for a public broadcaster, such as documentaries, arts and culture, children's shows, and regional reflection. Like you, we wish it were not necessary to impose this kind of detailed regulatory monitoring and oversight. We understand the value of flexibility. However, we cannot support CBC when it asks you to trust it to do the right thing, Recent past experience shows that such trust would be misplaced. Since the previous license renewal 13 years ago, the CBC has walked away from numerous commitments and now wants to be let off the hook for many more. This must not be allowed to happen. CBC says many of these decisions are financially motivated. They simply cannot afford to do these things anymore. We disagree. We think it is a matter of choices. Does the CBC want to be a public service broadcaster or a commercial broadcaster that loses $1 billion a year? Unfortunately, the CBC has answered that question in the response to interventions where it says, more than once, that it wants to be treated like any other broadcaster. They've tried to backpedal on that this week, but their words speak for themselves. Well, Mr. Chair and Commissioners, the CBC is not any other broadcaster. The CBC is Canada's national public broadcaster with pride of place in the Broadcasting Act, and it should and it must be treated accordingly. In the ongoing absence of a transparent, arm's-length, professional system for appointing the corporation's chair, directors, and CEO, an absence that Friends deplores, we are forced to look elsewhere for an appropriate governance model. Friends would like the Commission to create a distinct regulatory regime specifically for the CBC. Failing that, we invite you to examine and recommend a system along the lines of the BBC Trust, which, while not without its flaws, does provide an independent means to ensure that key strategic decisions of the public broadcaster are scrutinized to determine whether or not they make a positive contribution to public value. Under such a system, the CBC would not have been allowed to, for instance, unilaterally abandon the program format for Radio 2 without an opportunity for public input. Without such safeguards, we respectfully submit that proceedings like this are far less meaningful than they should be. The CBC is called on the carpet every decade or more, and in between apparently gets to do pretty much whatever it likes. The CBC boasts about its many forms of public accountability. However, there is an important difference between simple reporting and real accountability. Friends submits that when it comes to actually listening to what Canadians want and acting on the input, the CBC's performance leaves a lot to be desired. The unfortunate result is that many of its strongest supporters are losing patience with the CBC. That would be a tragedy, as it would capitulate to those forces that are opposed to a robust and independent public broadcaster. We need to turn this downward spiral around by increasing the real and perceived value of the CBC to Canadians. Commissioners, the idea of public broadcasting is too important to abandon. We need to help CBC learn how to earn and deserve renewed public support, and then mobilize that support to advocate for resources to do its job. I'd be pleased to answer your questions, but first I'd like to give the rest of Friends 10 minutes to a few more comments from some of our and the CBC's friends.
The CBC I want will be fair and reflective of all people in Canada, no matter what area of Canada they come from, what age they are, or what type of music they prefer to listen to. All voices have to be heard on CBC.
And being able to hear Canadian orchestras on CBC had a huge influence, and I think helped inspire me to be able to pursue that dream of playing music professionally.
I want the CBC to put a face to abstractions like poverty, unemployment, sustainability, environmental degradation, the joy that we take in life. I want CBC to show me that in all the richness and detail that this country has to offer.
People think the digital revolution makes a public broadcaster less important. Au contraire, it's more important.
A private broadcaster's mission is the acquisition and maintenance of a profit stream. A public broadcaster's mission is the acquisition and maintenance of nationhood.
And so for this reason, I encourage all of you to support CBC, and in particular, to support an ad-free CBC radio.
I think the current dilemma, the current fight, the current struggle, the current conversation about CBC is a broader conversation about public space in Canada. Because it's a public broadcaster, it is public space in the media. Like a park in a city is public space.
Sorry, thank you very much. So that's the end of your presentation.
That's all I've got.
That's perfect. I'm just asking. So Commissioner Duncan will have some questions for you to start off with.
So, good morning. First of all, that might be all you have to say at this very minute, but you certainly said a lot in your submission, and I read it with great interest. You're mentioning here in your comments this morning about you'd like the Commission to create a distinct regulatory regime specifically for the CBC. So I'm wondering if, because you've made a number of suggestions throughout your document on the various issues as to what would be a COL or an expectation, if we took all of those recommendations, would that comprise what you mean by a distinct regulatory regime? Or could you tell me more what you'd expect there?
Well, seeking not to repeat, first off, probably we have common ground that the CBC is not a broadcaster like any other. And all of those comments about we should be treated as like any other broadcaster are just, they're worth absolutely nothing. They should never have been put on the record, and shame on them for saying that. But beyond that, we think that you need to have CBC coming here from time to time, and time to time would never be 13 years. Your chair's predecessor, it's a blot on his record that those administrative decisions were made to delay CBC coming back here. So from time to time, the CBC should be coming here and should be held to a higher standard than the private sector. There's a lot of detail in our presentation on this. I particularly commend to your attention and would offer to provide you more detail if you wish on the application of the BBC Trust model as a mechanism. That would require a statutory change, but it is something that you could recommend. The status quo is just not good enough.
So then I do understand when you say to create a distinct regulatory regime, if that was as far as we could go, incorporating your recommendations would address that line, but then you overall, over that you offer, beyond that you offer the BCC Trust as a model. I think it would be useful. I don't know if staff would already have that document, but I think it would be useful to submit it if you would. Yeah.
Well, I'll write the Secretary General a letter.
Okay, that's fine. Sure, that would be great. I'm wondering, because you had mentioned in your submission, you had a lengthy section on the importance of sports to CBC and the significance if they were to lose that. And so I'm just wondering, following along on that point, I did ask, I raised the point with respect to the terms of license. I raised the recommendation that you had made that we make a provision to meet with CBC if they fail to negotiate that agreement again, renegotiate it, or under substantially the same terms. And they were not receptive to that idea. I don't know if you were listening to the hearing at that point. So I just wanted to, because I've read the document, and I mean, you certainly create a great cause of concern. I'm just wondering if you're satisfied or you're still holding your position, I guess, that we should put some provision in the license term as you recommended.
Yes, I would say we are completely dissatisfied with the CBC's response. Although I personally have not been able to listen to everything, I have arranged for people, many of them smarter than me, to be my eyes and ears. So I was fully familiar with the comments you made. Just to give you a summary, we have picked up information from sources we trust, and I don't think any of this information would be news to Nazir Mohammed or to George Cope or even to Gary Bettman. It's stuff that's out there. When we first publicized the concern after submitting it to you, a Globe and Mail reporter said, none of this is new, I knew all that. So our concern is, just to summarize it in a nutshell, currently the CBC is generating about $130 million of advertising revenue from Hockey Night in Canada and a few other small sports properties. In the last fiscal period, the last broadcast season, it was 53% of their ad revenue. Now, you have, of course, had access to a confidential briefing, and there are good reasons why that should be confidential. So you'll have a way of evaluating the broad strokes, but what we're trying to do is scope for you the importance. And so when you, and President Lacroix said, we are not a hockey channel. It has been reported to me, he so said. And that's true. But if you take the 8 months of the year, a typical year, not a year with a lockout, if you take the 8 months of the year when 400 hours of programming in prime time are related to professional sports, 90-something% of it hockey, what it is 40% a sports channel. There are about 1,000 hours of prime time in 8 months of the year, okay? So it's a very serious thing, and if they were to lose the rights, then the rights come up for negotiation. It's public knowledge next year. The current contract ends in 2014. That is only effectively, no matter how fast you put out a decision, that will only be the beginning of the second year of your decision. There might be a 400-hour prime time gap to fill in the schedule. Plug in a number. We plugged in $500,000. Maybe 400 is a better number, but $500,000 times that number of hours is $200 million. And so they're losing the ad revenue, and the whole business model is cast into doubt because the remaining ad revenue is just in...
Car toutes les autres recettes publicitaires, un peu plus de 100 millions de dollars, à la page 23 de notre mémoire, ils ont 80 millions de dollars de coûts pour le maintenir. Alors si ça devait arriver, et nous ne voulons pas que ça se passe, notre mandat, nous n'avons pas le mandat de 175 000 familles contre la famille.
Their competitors have deep pockets and can afford to take a long view, then it's appropriate to discuss these things, not to sweep them under the rug. And at the very least, they should have to come back here to explain themselves, because the loss of something in the order of $200 million to the corporation is not an English television network problem. It's a corporate problem. English, French, radio, television, everything, including the unregulated services.
I appreciate your comments and bringing them to our concern. Just based on the analysis you've done, what impact do you think the current lockout is having?
You can learn a fair bit about the current lockout impact by looking at the financials. It's quite serious. It will get much more serious if it continues longer. And I don't think the CBC has any influence over that. That's something that is almost, if not completely, beyond its control. But of the $130 million of revenue that they have, you can check this with your confidential briefing, about $50 million is the playoffs, which begin in the month of April. So, so the revenue is not spread out equally. It comes at the end, and when a season is canceled, they're going to have a very serious problem. Something in the range of the third year of the government's cuts from the 2012 budget.
So we're already going to experience the impact of hockey on their plans, even before the renewal.
Except that rational interests might align. That is to say, the CBC's interest, some American broadcasters' interests, the interests of the owners and the interest of the players might cause them to do the right thing. Who knows? I suppose in that there would not have been a First World War if everybody had been rational.
Well, certainly there's increasing pressure on people on the parties to settle. With respect to the regions and representation of the regions, What is your reaction to CBC's suggestion that new media would be the solution for reflecting the regions?
Profound disdain. It's, we think, by the way, I mean, let me say that having criticized a few things about the current management, I would say that their recognition of their regional responsibilities after a decade of trying to avoid that and withdraw from the regions of Canada. And by the way, I remember from a consultation once, somebody in Newfoundland once said to me, Toronto's also a region like all the others. The problem is that Toronto just doesn't get it. So talking about the regions, they are moving in the right direction, certainly in radio. Some of the news services are good. I do not have the high opinion, nor do our supporters have the high opinion of that Hamilton initiative that others have presented. But one deficit that we see at the moment is, and this would come back to conditions of license, it would be that a certain amount of programming for the network, I'm talking television here, should be coming from the regions. And we suggest a number like 40%. It's something you can do. It's not inherently more expensive to make a program one place rather than another. There are the problems with provincial tax incentives and all of that, but you could be pushing the English television network to do a minimum, and we suggest 40%, beyond the, what is that definition, 120, 150 kilometers from
Yes.
Toronto City Hall or something?
So did you have a chance to look at the amended COLs that CBC filed on Tuesday?
I do have that here somewhere.
And I'm just wondering, they say there that they don't feel they can make a specific commitment to non-news local programming due to financial constraints.
Yeah.
And I think this is the same condition that we're talking about, that they should be held to have a certain percentage from the regions.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in.
Well, if you have a chance when they do come back here, you're still in a position to pose questions to them. Try to find out why national programming coming from other places than the network headquarters is inherently more expensive.
Okay. Thank you. We'll ask them that. I'm just. I had some other questions here. I was actually hoping to have my lunch hour to get more organized with my questions. So if you'll just don't mind.
Well, you'll probably have a better lunch, Commissioner, as a result.
Well, I suppose so. See? Okay. Yes, every cloud has a silver lining or some such thing as that. Yeah. Yeah. So on the first run programming, I take your point that that you feel there should be a requirement. You note in your study that of that Toronto station that the higher percentage of, the lower percentage of repeat in prime time, but much higher in outside of prime time, but you're recommending a general 50% across the board?
That's our recommendation, but we're just drawing to your attention something that was, these are your data, by the way. I mean, you own the logs. All we did was run them through a machine, you know. But
we don't come up with pretty pictures like that one you came up with.
But it's going in the wrong direction. It's the velocity, as an economist would say, of the repeats that is wrong. And I think what you can do without interfering in minute detail in the corporation's management is to either encourage or require a change in that direction, that there should be some balance between original and repeat programming. Of course, that has a fiscal implication, but you know, ultimately, if you think about repeats, once you get to 100% repeats, you have no programming.
Well, actually, my next question was what impact you thought that would have on their costs, but actually, you sort of averaged it out. It would seem there'd be no impact on their costs from that recommendation because you had very high original content in prime time.
It's like in accounting, failing to amortize a capital cost and living off it until something bad happens. There's an analogy to be made.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to continue just bear with me a second while I... CBC did address some of your comments in their response on October the 19th. And I don't know if you have any, just let me hear. Your answer about the multi-platform approach to serve the regions, you spoke in terms of the Hamilton experience, but I was actually thinking more than that, and that was because I'm concerned that people outside of, well, not everybody has equal broadband capability, for one thing, and I'm concerned that not everybody is interested in using computers. Not everybody can, not everybody can afford it, not everybody's interested. I just don't know that this is the proper solution for regional programming.
Ah, yes. Well, okay, you raised that earlier, and I took you away from it.
Yes.
Well, sorry proves that you're a Canadian. But, you know, the phrase digital citizen, you know, that some of the people that we just showed you on video have coined, you should not have to be digital to be a citizen. And the Broadcasting Act does not say that. And so, and we're living in a country with an increasingly aging population. There are a number of people, for a number of reasons, who do not wish or have the capacity or cannot afford that. And I think it's the role of your commission, at least implied, if not explicitly stated in the various statutes, to look out for those people. I mean, they need you to look out for them. We haven't done any recent polling about public expectations of the CRTC, but we have, you know, at an earlier point in this century, and there's quite a bit of trust in this institution to protect the public.
It's interesting because not only in fairness to the people living in the regions, which is where I come from, but these digital citizens that you talk about, they're not everybody in Toronto, I expect, is a digital citizen either. So it's, I think, first of all, it's a poor approach for regional, because for that reason, I think there's so a more limited local content in the region. So I think
you mentioned, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overspeak.
Sorry,
you mentioned Hamilton. Because it's a digital service, you and I and friends in Whitehorse can watch it. And I urge you to surprise them by just watching it at random some hour. See what you think about it.
All right, I will. Interesting, you mentioned there Whitehorse, or Whitehorse, you said? Did you in your example?
Off the top of my head, I guess.
Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
But I'm thinking Yellowknife. But CBC in their presentation, this is one of the instances where they talk about they want to be treated like the commercial broadcasters. They want the 14 hours and the 7 hours. But when you think about a community like Yellowknife, which would be less appealing to a commercial broadcaster, do you think that's a fair approach? Shouldn't the CBC be required to provide more and better service in that area? And I know that they're saying they will continue to offer 10.5 hours, but not by condition or expectation. They'll do it on their own. They'll trust us, one of those features. Do you think, I don't put words in your mouth, do you think that it's the proper approach for the public broadcaster to want to have the same condition in that respect as a commercial broadcaster?
I think, at the risk of repeating myself, it's completely unacceptable. I mean, if you were a CBC manager, it would make your life easy, wouldn't it? I mean, it would be a rationale for doing less, but it would be and in a sense, I think I'm quoting you, Commissioner Duncan, to say the commercial broadcaster that loses $1 billion a year. It's that kind of value set, and it's your task, in our view, to hold them to a higher standard, and that involves a whole range of things. COL, conditions of license, are part of that, but the governance structure, all of the accountability things also come into play. But yes, to more hours in Yellowknife.
I did have the opportunity, since I've been on the commission, to visit CBC in Yellowknife. And they have a great operation there, very enthusiastic people, and we enjoyed visiting with them. So I know they're committed.
I
It
find,
is budget-related.
I mentioned it in French at the beginning, that we're doing nothing in our submission is designed to criticize the dedicated people who make programming, the people who were, sitting before me at this table. The criticism is only of the senior management, sometimes people who, through no fault of their own, don't have the kind of skills and experience they should have to manage the most important cultural institution in the country. But what you described in Yellowknife, I have been in so many CBC radio and television stations around this country, and there are so many dedicated people working very, very hard. The kind of things that the Media Guild people said are definitely true, and it's something to celebrate. But those people need more encouragement, more leadership. They need more resources. They're really pressed.
Thank you for that, and I think we're in agreement on that. I just want to, you're opposed to the commercialization of Radio 1 and Radio 2.
Yeah.
Am I correct in that?
Yes.
And, but then I think you say that, just bear with me a second here, that you want the minimum hours, you want an expectation. First of all, just bigger picture, let me step back a bit. I noticed that a number of your points are COLs and a number of expectations. And CBC seems to be wanting, as we know, we've talked about, more flexibility. But they seem to maybe want to move away from expectations and just deal with a couple of COLs. The fact that some of yours are stated as expectations versus COLs, do I assume that you would expect the CBC to put the same weight on them, whether they're a COL or an expectation?
You would hope so, wouldn't you? I mean, it's a difference between a legal and a moral obligation, and ethical people treat those moral things as important. But I guess I would say we have made a number of suggestions to the Commission regarding expectations and conditions of license. We trust you as commissioners and with your staff to look at the big picture and find a reasonable balance that you think will work. And that's not something that anybody on the outside can see, because you are in a position to see the big picture. But since you raised the question of commercials on Radio 2 and Espace Musique, we think that, and by the way, there was an image earlier, I've forgotten who raised it, about a cliff that you drop off and you never get back up. You got up that cliff in 1974. Your predecessors, you just forced the CBC out of commercial activity on radio, which it had been in since 1936. Climbing cliffs is not impossible if the will is there. But in this case, there is a bit of a slippery slope. And Radio 1, despite what President Lacroix says, I mean, I could quote what President Lacroix's predecessors said about ads back in the last hearings. They're completely at odds. And we think, let's see, Mr. Goldstein was on the CAB panel yesterday. He said that he thought CBC was lowballing the potential revenue. The data that we have gathered supports Mr. Goldstein's position. We think that this is turning, particularly the English side, Radio 2, into a kind of a profit center for the rest of the network. We think it's a shame. We also see it as, the change of format going 4 or 5 years ago, the introduction of ads, increasing popularization. We see a bit of a pattern here, and we think it's going in the wrong direction, and we urge you to stop it. And I also strongly support the private broadcaster's position. It's who's going to be hurt by this in an economic sense. It's going to be the radio broadcasters in small markets and the small broadcasters in big markets.
Now, I read your section on that, of course, in here, and do you have any more detailed forecasts than what were included in here?
Yeah, and if you like, I'd be happy to. I think the CBC said in the reply document, which we found on the web, the first time I've ever dealt with a broadcaster, by the way, that did not copy interveners to give them information on what they were doing. They wanted to be treated like other broadcasters. But we read in there that there's something about a secret report that we had. If you're interested, we can pull that report together and put it into a form that could be part of your record.
Well,
it would take me a few days to do so, I would
think that would be very helpful. It would,
How long would it take for you to propose that?
Can I do a best efforts here? That we would do our best efforts to get it to you by, say, Tuesday.
Right. I'm not saying that it's necessarily on the record yet. We'll have to look at it.
Okay.
But
no, but anything that is useful to you officially or unofficially, I mean, we don't care if it's on the record. It's just we're trying to contribute to the process.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. But when by the end of the day Tuesday, to the Secretary and copying CBC, please.
Okay.
Or if it's a publicly available document, you
no, but we always copy the broadcasters when we do that. We know the rules.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So with respect to then regional live music, I think that was the point you were trying to make at 183 of your submission. And it's not that you didn't make your point clearly, it's just that I'm rushing trying to read my point, my own point. But
you said paragraph 183?
183, yes. You're talking about the amount of regionally originated production in general and of regional live music in particular. And that live music, of course, was one of the areas I understood CBC to say would be cut out of or reduced on Radio 2 and Espace Musique if
Mr. Steinmetz said that on Tuesday, I think, here, did he not? If I understand from what's been reported to me, I may have seen a transcript.
The CBC panel did say that it would be eliminated if they didn't get reduced if they didn't.
What was wrong with what they said, according to all my information, and I've got some good information, is the tense of the sentence. They have already done that. Like we don't actually see what more they can cut. They have greatly reduced some of the services that used to be taken for granted on Radio 2. I'm not as familiar with Espace Musique, and by the way, Espace Musique is a different case. You know, as we see it now, the world classical culture is down to 40% in bad times of day on Radio 2, but Espace Musique has 60% of that, so that they're not the same thing at all.
I noticed just along those lines that you make a point in your presentation about the cuts proposed, or well, I guess they'd be cuts if it doesn't get approved, but the way their forecasts were drawn up, the hardship was imposed to a greater extent on Radio 2 instead of Espace Musique, or not equally on both.
Speaking off the top of my head, I didn't bring all my papers here, honestly, but my recollection is that the projections, you'll have them in the record, going out, say, 2 or 3 years, they've got a revenue, you know, in the 17, I'm speaking in ranges here, $17 million range from Radio 2, and something like 1.5 for Espace Musique. And then we looked at the total cost of the services, and for some reason, Espace Musique is, you know, up there at the same cost as Radio 2. So if their plans happened, we think they would have more revenue, but if their plans happened, the people of Canada, through the parliamentary allocation, would be supporting Espace Musique, and Radio 2 would be contributing to the CBC's bottom line 3 years out. That's our reading of it. I don't know if you have a different view, but...
No, well, I think that's an interesting comment, and perhaps speaks to the credibility of their projections, would you say, or?
We think their projections are too modest. But I'll tell you where the real money is, and that's Radio 1 and La Première Chaîne. That's where the real money is. You get up to much larger amounts, and that will be included in what I will send you.
And it seems that the move to commercialization on the radio service would probably in the future, you'd be concerned, I gather from your comments, would change the nature of those services,
well,
like it did on the television.
Sitting quietly in the back, I was here Monday morning, and then I had to go out west because the Prime Minister very unkindly called by-elections, and I was hosting public broadcasting all candidates meetings in Calgary and Victoria. But I noticed as I had to walk out, the great Mark Starowitz sitting here, now responsible for documentaries. And Starowitz was involved at the time when radio lost its commercials, and many people call that the renaissance of radio. You know, it was just like a complete rebirth of the power of CBC Radio as a distinctive service, something you'd expect from a public broadcaster. It enjoys a huge loyalty with Canadians, way beyond its 10 or 15% audience share. People, you know, if you check, do they tune in at least half hour a week? The radio is such a powerful thing. It's, you know, people tend also to tune in to a favorite radio channel or service, whereas with television, they're shopping around, they're watching programs. And so what has been proposed, we like to, more in sorrow than in anger, we like to think is being proposed by people who just don't get it, just how important this is to the public broadcaster's mandate and the fidelity of the Canadian people to public broadcasting.
I noticed that, I believe that you make a comment in here that, what was it, 175,000 people that responded to your survey, or?
No, I think you might be confusing us with the Reimagine people. We did not compete with Reimagine on a survey. We've cooperated with them. But what we did was we analyzed, you remember your commission called this hearing originally for September of 2011, and we took the 1 year gap, gave us a chance to do a very detailed content analysis of something like 2007 actually, submissions that had been put into your, I guess, no, they weren't all put in because you had canceled it before the deadline date. So we just analyzed them all, and that gave us some background. We actually have, our group is supported by 175,000 Canadian families. So we estimate you can at least, you know, almost double that in terms of the people that communicate with us about these things. I mean, for example, I know about problems with CBC and complaints, as Louise Poirier raised earlier, because I hear from these people all the time.
So, but I thought what I had read was that, and maybe you could speak to that, was the impact on that audience of commercializing those two radio stations. Are you seem to indicate that they'd lose the audience.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between our supporters and the Canadian public. Our supporters are people who believe intensely in something. Through polling, you can find out that by the way, every poll that we've ever commissioned is on our website. There are about 15 of them, including the one that asks about the CRTC. So I'm not pretending that our membership base reflects Canadians, although we can measure the extent to which it does. But I was struck by I've forgotten the name, but a woman who is an expert that was called by the CBC to support its position on the Radio 2 advertising question. And she said at one point that something like almost half of the people that she surveyed said they would tune in quite a bit less. And I thought she was going off message, but she's an expert. She's telling the truth, you know. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Morrison. I think you've answered my questions. I'll have some later if I come tomorrow. But I'll give my colleagues a chance. Thank you very much.
Okay. Mr. Vice Chair.
I had some questions that I think Ms. Duncan sort of did the rounds of them. A really interesting presentation. Also like the subtle art that you have of sending messages out there. It's really quite well done. But to the CBC specifically, first of all, allowing commercials on Radio 2 would certainly change the nature and the experience of the listener. That's pretty clear. You would agree with that, Mr. Morrison?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, number one, supposing you have 12 minutes an hour, just take that as a number, of commercials, you just reduced the programming by 25%.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry,
and in terms of
20%. Yeah, 20%.
12, 20.
20,
yeah.
yeah.
And in terms of the accounting, two issues came up yesterday. Obviously, a lot of issues came up. One of them was that they were sort of lowballing their estimates. The other issue was, did you see in the cutbacks that there was disproportionate cutting of Radio 2 and Espace Musique as a proportion of the parliamentary allocation to CBC?
I think the most meaningful thing, if you and I put ourselves in the mindset of the senior management of the CBC, and there's a shortage of money, what are we going to do? I don't think you would look at how you're cutting up the parliamentary allocation. You look at the whole thing. So again, I don't walk around with the decimal places in the back of my head, but it's about $1.8 billion for the SRC CBC. So when we look at the size and scope of radio in that whole thing, it comes out somewhere like 16%, you know? Let's say 15, just to rough it. So if radio takes a cut that is, you know, you have to think that the other services, including the unregulated services, they all do their share. Radio's cut should only be that 1/7. And we think that they have disproportionately suffered to date for some reason, and we don't know why.
With the ultimate view perhaps being to make a better case for allowing commercial revenue to come through the second station.
I'm old enough to have learned not to imply motives to other people egregiously, you know, so I just don't know why they do their bad things.
In terms of programming in CanCon, you heard the you know, all kinds of numbers. 100% should be 75%, should be 80%. Are you comfortable with the numbers that are being offered in terms of? Yeah, sorry.
We would insist that the numbers should be compatible between the English and the French services, and the number 80 seems like a good and reasonable number to us. And I commend to your attention the wise words of our Prime Minister, quoted on the first page of our brief, where he said that it would be a good thing to have more programming in the 20% coming from other parts of the world rather than just American commercial programming.
Yeah, and I guess we can't stress the importance of original programming. You mentioned it earlier.
Because the Broadcasting Act says so, you know, it's right there. Yeah.
And are you comfortable with the proposition that's been put forth by CBC Radio-Can on original programming?
At the risk of repetition, but I think I responded to Commissioner Duncan at one point saying we think that there should be a commitment, I'm talking English television, to put a certain proportion of entertainment programming outside
to come in from the regions. What was the percentage? Because I missed that.
I said 40.
40%.
We suggest that to you. I mean, you might in your wisdom decide that some other number is better, and if we would be very happy if you just put that on your list of issues to be dealt with.
Well, I was taking notes and I didn't get the actual number, so I'm happy we cleared that up. I don't want to get into details of the hockey sort of situation, but you made an interesting case. You know, if you conservatively calculate that an hour of television will cost you $500,000, and you multiply that by 400 hours, you've got a $200 million spend.
You can subtract the 15 million profit, I'll call it, that we believe they currently have. So maybe you're
On the hockey side.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
maybe
yeah.
the net result is something like 185. It doesn't matter. Conceptually, it's the same.
It's still a lot. Yeah, no, there's 100 million, there's 15 million in profit potentially. So even if you subtract that, you're still short $185 million.
Yeah. And they don't appear to admit that. And now they've given you confidential information, so behind closed doors, maybe you can hash that out. We would be very happy to be wrong, but we don't think we are.
Well, they don't want to speak. They don't even want to discuss the hypothetical.
Well,
if you follow the
Commissioner,
presentation Monday.
Yeah, it's amazing when a deal is done by the NHL with an American broadcaster. A press release comes out from the American broadcaster. We've just done a deal. It's worth this much over so many years. When a deal is done in this country, it's Official Secrets Act. You know, it's an amazing thing how different it is across the border.
And at the end of the day, there should be a contingency plan for filling those 400 hours.
Well, if you
and that's the position of.
If you ignored this, you would be ignoring something on a scale larger than the cut, the 3-year cut that the Minister of Finance imposed in March, and at least according to us. And you would be, the blank check image is not intended to be discourteous, but if you were to ignore it, I guess I will risk that and say, I think you'd be writing them a blank check, because something fundamental could change in the second year of a license, 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, it doesn't matter how long the license is, that would be on a scope and scale so severe to CBC's interest that at the very least they should be back here explaining what the hell they're going to do about it. You know, I should remove the word hell from that sentence.
That's fine.
Yes. Okay.
Good Canadian, as you said earlier. Sorry, and no, no hell. But wouldn't that be tantamount to almost creating sort of 2 separate licenses, or 2 separate sort of conditions of license within that license, one with the hockey and one without it?
Well, that might possibly be a problem, but you folks are creative people, and so we would be, what we're really suggesting is an idea, and the idea is you should find a way to make sure, not just to leave it to them to volunteer to come back retrospectively, like the eloquent defense of the Radio 2 changes that came 5 years after the fact a couple of days ago. You should find a way to make sure that they come back here and explain it to you, and through your public process to the people of Canada.
And that position is warranted, given that they're not a sports channel, but 40% of their content is sports based, if you will.
If anything,
according to what you told us today.
Yeah, and I was trying to be a bit ironic. I think they are a sports channel dressed up as an all-purpose channel, I guess, right now. You know, that there's an excessive dependence, obviously. I mean, you can see it if you compare SRC television and the English television network.
Well, and when you do look at SRC, I mean, SRC did find a way to come out of not having hockey.
Yeah, and to be fair, the economics are different. It's a different issue, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. I want to bring you back to, I'm glad we got into the details of the regulatory role that we have to play, because after all, we're a statutory body, right? We only have the powers that the Act provides to us. That's the system of the rule of law we live in. And I must say, and it's not just you, but I'm a bit surprised by some of the recommendations we're getting this week by certain parties. You know, we live in a parliamentary democracy that finds its roots several hundred years ago, in fact. And we have a situation, and you may not like it personally, and others may not like it, but budgets are presented and voted on annually by our elected officials. And as I say, it's an annual affair, except for a few statutory programs. Parliamentary budgets are an annual thing, and that goes back to the very origins of our parliamentary democracy. You raise some issues about the BBC trusts and the governments in the UK. they have around the BBC, all interesting ideas that have been studied by others, but you know, my understanding is machinery of government issues are the exclusive prerogative of Cabinet and the Prime Minister. And he usually looks to his officials in the Privy Council office for advice on that and not the CRTC.
Well, you would have a better perspective on that than most of us.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, frankly, and getting back to our statutory mandate, if indeed the government wanted, because we are arm's length with each our roles and responsibility, if they wanted our view on the right governance model for the CBC, Section 15 of the Broadcasting Act would allow them to ask our opinion on that. So I'm in light of all that, I'm a bit surprised about some of your recommendations that we would somehow go beyond what is our statutory body power and start giving advice on things that we haven't been asked an opinion on.
I recall a press report early in your incumbency where you were quoted as saying that something like, we don't want to give the government too much advice, and we expect them not to give us too much advice, or something like that. And the Parliament is sovereign, and the duly elected Government of Canada makes fiscal decisions. But I think if you see, as we see, a gap or a problem in the way the CBC is regulated and is accountable or not sufficiently accountable, you have the right, maybe not the responsibility, to articulate that. And I guess maybe in our choice of words it was infelicitous, but if you share our view that the problem is serious enough, I think you can find a way to validate that in your decision without perhaps without you writing a letter to the Prime Minister, Mr. Chair.
I take your point on that.
Okay.
In fact, the accountability of the CBC I mentioned as right at the beginning is something we'll turn our minds to, as we do for every broadcaster. We're not treating them any differently. There are reports, and probably even more so in this case.
We want you to treat them differently.
Well, in the sense that, you know, our jurisdiction, the scope of our jurisdiction is not any different for the CBC. In terms of accountability and our ability to ask them for reports and so forth. And what I was going to add, perhaps even more so in view of the fact that the source of their funding is obviously public money, but also that's drawn from parliamentary appropriations, but also public money through contributions delivered through broadcast distribution undertakings. Yeah. So there's a lot of public money there. I'm not disputing that. It's just some of these other suggestions, and you're not the only one, and I'm not singling you out. I know
well, I'll take responsibility for all the others.
I'm not taking issue with the fact that you may disagree with some choices that have been made in terms of the level of funding, but we have to execute our statutory authorities and obligations within a given set of facts, and that, I think, the level of funding is something that we have to deal with.
I think isn't that paragraph 3 of my oral remarks this morning? We understand that completely, and our position with the corporation is that instead of becoming less and less of a public service broadcaster and more of a commercial broadcaster, which loses $1 billion a year, it is important that they make choices. And so in a big picture sense, were they to lose the rights to Hockey Night in Canada, they say we're not going to lose the rights to Hockey Night in Canada. How? I'm sure they say that, but can we really believe that that would be the case? I mean, they could lose those rights. And should that happen, something fairly serious is going to happen to the whole model of the English television network. The amount of commercial revenue is going to drop way, way down, and certain sunk costs for selling it. It's an appropriate time to think about their whole business model you make questions about business models of all kinds of people who come before you. So I think we're in the ballpark of in the comments we're making, and obviously you take or do not take advice based on your understanding of your responsibility.
And we will be guided in large part, not exclusively, in large part by Section 3.1M, which actually defines what the corporation's mandate is, and Section 5, which talks about the regulatory obligations we have, and 5.2 about our regulatory obligations, and that gets all put in the mix.
Some people memorize Shakespeare sonnets. I memorize Section 3.1M, but I don't want to have to prove it to you right
Yeah,
now.
no, I'm sure you do. Unfortunately, it's somewhat less poetic than Shakespeare's sonnet, but let's count the paragraphs rather than the ways. Thank you. Those are my questions. I believe Vice Chair has a follow-up.
Yes, now that you're in the mood for taking responsibility for one and all, let's put something else on those broad shoulders. Sure. The Ombudsman. Would you speak to us on the feeling amongst the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting as to the role of the Ombudsman?
Yeah.
And if there's room for improvement?
The worst no that you got from President Lacroix was no to the independence of the Ombudsman. And I think you shouldn't let go of that question. That was a very important question. There is, I'm not going to finger any individuals, but there's too much of a clubby inside the network. Many of the people who've been ombuds people are, put in a position to kind of judge their former colleagues. They're inside the loop, and that bothers us. And in one or two occasions, we believe that they have actually been eased out through subtle means. We don't think that they are. And if there were, I think there is an international association of ombudsmen. If they had some type of quality assurance system, we don't think CBC would be at the top. I'll put it that way. So I think you should find some way to make sure that when the ombudsman says something and CBC management doesn't like it, that you hear about it, that it should somehow come back to the regulator, because it is an accountability. I mean, I don't have to sell you on the value of an ombudsman. It's something that the Swedes introduced in this planet 50 years ago. It's widely understood. Even the city I come from has an ombudsman. So we would like that ombudsman function to work better, and we encourage you not to let that. Don't take no for an answer, in other words.
Would you have a formula to propose as to the nomination of said ombudsman?
Well, my understanding, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that generally speaking, the CEO puts together some type of committee that and invites candidates to apply, and there's an interview type of process. And my understanding is that the chair of that committee is usually not inside CBC SRC. That's good. But it's pretty opaque to the public. You tend to hear about it after the person is appointed, and I stand by my clubbiness comment. So I think you should push on that. That is not interference in some matter of scheduling or something like that. That's a fundamental accountability issue, akin to what I said earlier about the difference between reporting and accountability.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I think those are our questions. Thank you for appearing and bringing the views that you gathered through your networks. It's very much appreciated.